She didn't call the police. She didn't call her mother. She didn't call anyone. She just stood at the edge of a hole she had dug with her own hands for 19 days straight. Blisters through gloves, through skin, into something harder underneath, and she looked down at a United States Navy manifest stamped "Eyes Only," dated September 15, 1944, listing 47 American soldiers used as lab rats by their own government, killed, sealed inside a ship's hold, and buried on her grandmother's farm. And then her phone rang. It was her mother, Clara. "Whatever you found out there, put it back, please. Put it back and sell the farm and come home." Clara looked at the 47 names on the paper in her hands. She looked at the ring her grandmother had kept hidden for 70 years. The engagement ring from a man nobody in her family had ever been allowed to name. She hung up because 3 generations of women in her family had been told to put it back, and she was the first one who wasn't going to. The plow caught something hard. Clara Holt felt it before she heard it. A jolt up the steering column, into her arms, into her teeth. The kind of vibration that meant metal had kissed metal somewhere down in a field that wasn't supposed to have any metal in it at all. She killed the engine. The morning went quiet in the way mornings only go quiet on a Kentucky farm in late spring. A crow somewhere above the tree line. The tick of a hot tractor cooling down through its iron bones. Nothing else for as far as the ear could reach. She climbed down, boots in the dirt, knees popping the way they'd been popping ever since Boston. Ever since the divorce. Ever since she'd packed up everything she owned that was worth packing and pointed a rented U-Haul south on I-65 with the windows down and the radio off because she hadn't been able to stand the sound of other people's music that morning. She knelt. She brushed the dirt back with her glove, first in slow strokes, then faster. Then she pulled the glove off entirely and brushed with her bare hand because the glove was clumsy, and because something about the moment made her want to feel whatever this was with her own skin before she decided what to do about it. Cold. Cold the way iron is cold even in summer. Cold the way a headstone is cold under your palm at a graveside, even when the sun has been on it all morning. Clara pulled her hand back slowly. She looked at the dirt under her fingernails. She looked at the faint outline of something in the earth that her hand had cleared. She didn't know yet that her grandmother had spent 70 years waiting for someone to find this. She didn't know yet that her mother had spent 40 years praying nobody ever would. She just knew the thing under her fingers was cold and smooth in a way that had nothing to do with limestone, and that it shouldn't be there, so she stood up, walked back to the tractor, got the small spade out of the toolbox, and started to dig. 3 months earlier, she had been a 30-year-old accountant in a 6th-floor walk-up in Allston, Massachusetts, with a husband who had stopped looking at her, and a job that had stopped looking at her too. Both events had arrived on roughly the same Tuesday in March, a year she would later refer to, when she could refer to it at all, as the year the ground gave out. The husband was Owen. The job was at a mid-size firm on Boylston Street, where she had been reconciling other people's numbers for 4 years, and had gotten very good at the reconciling, and had never once felt anything about it. The apartment was leased in both their names. The framed photograph of her grandmother above the radiator was hers alone. The plants were hers. The dog was Owen's mother's dog and had never pretended otherwise. Everything else was up for grabs. The photograph showed a woman in a cotton dress standing in front of a Kentucky farmhouse, black and white, faded at the corners and along the left edge where the light had gotten to it over the years. The woman wasn't smiling. She wasn't sad either. She was looking at the camera the way some women look at cameras when they have made a private decision not to give the camera what it came for and have found the decision easy to keep. Clara had been 8 years old the last time she had seen that woman in person. The woman in the photograph was Clara's grandmother, Margaret Dune. She had died 3 months before Owen moved out, alone, in a hospital bed in Henderson County, Kentucky, 640 miles from her only daughter and her only granddaughter, neither of whom had come in the last years of her life, and neither of whom had come for the end of it. Clara had not gone to the funeral. Her mother, Louise Holt, had not gone either. It was the kind of thing they did not discuss. There was a long list of those in the Holt family, and Clara had grown up understanding that the list existed without ever being handed a copy of it. So when the letter arrived from a small-town lawyer in Kentucky, telling her that her late grandmother had left her the farmhouse, the barn, and the 40 acres around them, probate already cleared and her name on the deed, Clara had read the letter twice. She poured a glass of cheap wine. She called her mother. The conversation lasted 11 seconds. "Sell it, Clara? Mom? I haven't even." "Sell it. Take the money. Move on with your life." The line went dead. Clara had stared at her phone for a long time after that. Then she had looked up at the framed photograph above the radiator. The woman in the cotton dress had looked back to her with the same expression she had been looking at the camera with for 80 years. The expression of someone who had already decided what she would and would not give, and who was not going to revisit the decision on account of a phone call or a cheap glass of wine. Clara had not sold the farm. She had packed the U-Haul instead, loaded the framed photograph last with particular care, and driven 640 miles south. She arrived in Henderson County, Kentucky, on a Tuesday in late April with 3 suitcases, a box of books she probably wouldn't read, and absolutely no plan beyond the next 48 hours. That had been 6 weeks ago. The farmhouse was worse than the photograph had let on. The clapboard was peeling in long, pale curls that collected in the window wells and along the porch rail. The porch itself sagged at the south end, in a way that made Clara feel slightly drunk when she walked to the railing to look at the yard. The kitchen smelled like a place that had finished its conversation with the world some time ago and was simply waiting for someone to open a window. There was a deer skull on the mantel in the front room that Clara could not remember ever being there as a child, and there was nobody alive she could call to ask about it. She had spent the first week scrubbing, the second week patching screens, the third week trying to remember how to drive a tractor she had last touched at age 7, her grandmother's tractor, an old Ford 8N with a clutch that fought back and a throttle that required negotiation. By week 4, she could plow a passable furrow without grinding the gears. By the middle of week 5, she had met Frank Calloway. Frank Calloway lived in the small white house at the bend in the gravel road. He was 78 years old. He walked with the slow, weighted gait of a man who had spent his whole life lifting things heavier than he should have and had decided some time ago that the weight was simply part of who he was now. Pale blue eyes set deep beneath a brow that had seen a great deal of weather. A jaw that suggested he had said no to a great many things over a great many years and had meant it every time he said it. He had come up to the fence on a Thursday afternoon while Clara was sorting through the rusted implements in the barn, deciding which ones were useful and which ones were simply rust held together by memory. He leaned on the fence post for a long time before he spoke. Long enough that Clara had started to wonder if he was going to speak at all, or if he had simply come to lean. "You look like her," that was all. He had turned and walked back to his own porch before Clara had figured out how to answer. She watched him go. He moved without hurry and without looking back. When he reached his own porch, he sat down in the chair that was clearly his chair and looked out at something that was not Clara's barn, and his face was the face of a man sitting with a thought he had been sitting with for a very long time. She had been thinking about that sentence ever since, and she had been thinking about the way he had looked at the eastern corner of the property. Just once, a quick glance that caught itself mid-turn and redirected, the way a man glances at something he has trained himself not to stare at. The way a person looks at a thing they have been watching from the corner of their eye for 45 years. Clara had noticed. She had not said anything. She wasn't sure yet what there was to say. Now, 6 weeks into Kentucky and approximately 3 minutes into the discovery of something in the ground that should not have been in the ground, Clara set the small spade aside and walked back to the barn for a bigger one. The bigger spade was her grandmother's. The handle was worn smooth in the places where a right hand would grip and the left hand would brace. The initials were carved into the wood near the top, with what had clearly been a pocket knife, the letters slightly uneven in the way of someone who had carved their name into a thing they intended to keep. M.D. Margaret June. Clara had stared at those initials for a long minute the first day she found the tool, standing in the barn with the light coming in sideways through the gaps in the siding. Then she had carried the spade back to the porch and leaned it against the railing the way you lean a thing that matters. The way you treat something that has been waiting for you. She brought it out, now, walked back to the disturbed earth, and dug. The dirt came up in heavy black clods, sweet and slightly sour with the particular richness of bottomland that had been left fallow for decades. She worked the spade around the edge of whatever the metal thing was, widening the circle, taking off the top layer first the way her father had taught her once on a vegetable patch in a Boston suburb when she was 9 years old, the last summer before he got sick. She didn't think about her father much, most days. She wasn't thinking about him now. She was thinking about how the metal kept getting larger. At first she had assumed it was a stone. A buried boulder her grandmother had farmed around for years, the kind of thing the limestone country was full of. Except stone wasn't cold like this. Stone wasn't smooth like this. Stone didn't have rivets. Clara sat back on her heels. The thing in the dirt had rivets in it. Rivets the size of her thumb, black with rust, set in a curving plate of iron that arsed down into the earth in a direction her shovel couldn't follow without wider clearance. She brushed more dirt away with her hand, found the edge of another plate, found the seam where the two plates met with a precision that had nothing to do with nature. She kept digging. She dug for 3 hours. She forgot lunch, forgot water, forgot the email she was supposed to send to the unemployment office in Massachusetts, and the bill she was supposed to call about, and the fact that her phone was ringing somewhere in the cab of the tractor with a persistence that suggested it had been ringing for a while. By 2 in the afternoon she had cleared a circle 8 feet across. The thing in the ground had a shape now. The shape was not a shape that belonged on a farm in Kentucky in any era of history Clara could account for. It was the shape of an anchor, a real anchor, a ship's anchor, the kind of anchor that hung from the bow of a vessel the size of a city block. It was enormous. The fluke alone was larger than the hood of her truck. The shank disappeared down into the earth at a steep angle that her shovel could not follow without machinery she did not own. Clara stood up. She walked a slow circle around the thing she had uncovered, hands on her hips, then off her hips, then on her hips again. Thought, with the kind of clarity that only arrives when the brain has finally stopped trying to make sense of anything at all, the following. This is not a thing. This is the beginning of a thing. Because the shank went down and forward into the eastern corner of her property. The corner her grandmother had not farmed in 7 decades. The corner Frank Calloway had glanced at and caught himself glancing at. The corner everyone in town referred to, in the oblique way of people who have agreed to refer to something obliquely for long enough that the obliqueness has become habit, as the quiet acre. And from the base of the shank, just visible at the bottom of the pit she had dug, ran a chain. The links were as thick as her wrist, black with corrosion, crusted with 80 years of earth. They ran east, somewhere east, into the part of the farm that nobody in her family had walked in 3 generations. Clara Moore stood in the middle of her grandmother's field and thought, for the first time since she had put Boston in the rearview mirror, that maybe her mother had been right. Maybe she should have sold. The thing she didn't do that afternoon was tell anyone. She didn't call her mother. She didn't call Sandra Pruitt, her best friend from Boston, who had been leaving voicemails for 6 weeks with increasing urgency, and had stopped leaving them about 10 days ago, which Clara suspected was worse than the voicemails. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't call the County Historical Society or the County Extension Office or any of the numbers she had collected in the first weeks on a notepad by the kitchen phone. She didn't call anyone. She walked back to the farmhouse, washed the dirt off her hands in the kitchen sink, watching the black water circle the drain. She poured a glass of bourbon from the bottle her grandmother had left in the cabinet over the refrigerator. A bottle Clara had been aware of since her 2nd day in the house, and had been afraid to touch. The way you are afraid to disturb anything that belonged to someone who is gone before you understand what they meant by it. She drank half of the glass standing at the counter, looking out the window at the eastern corner of the property. Then she went up to the attic. The attic was where she had been avoiding. She knew this. The attic was where her grandmother's life still was, boxed and stacked and covered with the particular dust that gathers on things that have been still for a very long time. The attic was where the trunk was. The trunk Clara had found on her 2nd day in the house and had not opened because there was no key, and because Clara had not had the heart, in those first raw weeks, to break the lock on something her grandmother had clearly meant to remain closed until the right moment. She climbed the narrow stairs. The attic smelled like cedar and old paper, and the particular quality of air that accumulates in a space where nothing has moved for 20 years. The trunk was where she had left it, brass corners gone green. Leather straps darkened with age and dried to a stiffness that made them look carved rather than worn. A small padlock at the front, blackened, the keyhole shaped like a teardrop turned on its side. Clara sat on the floor in front of it. She did not break the lock yet. She sat there for a while in the warm, close air of the attic with the afternoon light coming through the small window at the gable end, and she looked at the trunk, and she said out loud, to no one, in a voice that surprised her with how quiet it was, "What did you leave me, Grandma?" The attic did not answer. The attic, Clara was beginning to understand, was never going to answer in any direct way. The attic was a place where answers had been stored, possibly, but the answers had been stored on the assumption that someone would arrive who already knew the questions. And Clara did not know the questions yet, because nobody in her family had told her the questions. Because everyone who had known the questions had agreed, somewhere along the way, that the questions were better left unasked, and the answers better left in trunks with broken locks. She went back downstairs. She drank the second half of the bourbon. She slept that night with the bedroom window open and the curtain moving in the warm spring air. In her dreams she saw a young woman in a cotton dress, standing at the edge of a cornfield in a heavy rain, holding the hand of a man in a navy uniform that Clara had never seen before, neither of them speaking, the rain coming down hard enough to flatten the grass at their feet and turn the field road to mud, and somewhere behind them, half buried in the mud at the edge of the field, the curving black shape of an anchor. She woke at 4 in the morning. She lay in the dark for a long time listening to the farm, the creak of the old house releasing the heat of the day, a dog somewhere down the road, the distant call of a whippoorwill from the direction of the creek, nothing unusual, and yet she lay there as if she were listening for something specific, some sound she didn't have a name for yet. She did not sleep again. Frank Calloway was at the fence again the next morning. He was holding a paper grocery bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. He set both down on the top rail when he saw Clara come out of the house, and he waited for her to walk across the yard and reach the fence. He waited a few seconds longer than necessary after she reached it, the way a man waits when he is trying to decide not whether he is going to say what he came over to say, but how much of it. "Brought you these tomato starts. Figured you'd be wanting to get them in before the heat comes." "Thank you, Frank." He nodded at the bag without looking at her directly. His gaze went past her shoulder, east. "Saw your tractor sitting in the far field last night. Saw you'd been doing some clearing over there." Clara felt her shoulders settle a quarter inch. She did not move otherwise, just turning it over. "That corner there, the one your grandmother never touched." "Yes." Frank was quiet for a long moment. When he finally looked at her, his pale blue eyes were not unkind. They were also not warm. They were the eyes of a man who had spent a long time deciding how much truth he was allowed to hand to other people and how much was not his to give. "Your grandmother had her reasons. What were they?" "Not my place to say, Clara." "Then whose place is it?" He picked up the thermos without unscrewing the cap, held it the way a man holds something when he needs something to do with his hands that isn't talking. He looked past her again toward the eastern corner. The morning light was long and low across the field, and the pit she had dug yesterday was a dark shape at the edge of the clear ground, and the black curve of the anchor was just visible at the rim. He looked at it for a moment that went on long enough that Clara knew he had known it was there. "Maybe nobody," he said. Then he seemed to reconsider. "Or maybe not nobody, but it's not me." He walked back to his own house. Clara watched him go. She noticed that he did not look back at the anchor. He walked with a deliberateness that suggested he was choosing not to look at it. The way you choose not to look at something that has cost you something every time you've looked at it for 45 years. She picked up the bag of tomato starts and the thermos he had forgotten and carried both back to the porch. She sat on the top step. She stared at the eastern corner of her property. Then she walked back to the field. She walked all the way to the edge of the pit she had dug the day before. She stood at the rim and looked down at the curve of black iron half buried in Kentucky soil, 640 miles from the nearest ocean. She said, out loud to the anchor, "Who put you here?" The anchor did not answer, but the chain at the base of the shank ran east into the corner of the property that everyone in this county had agreed for 70 years was not a place to walk, and the morning was very quiet. She went back to the farmhouse. She broke the padlock on the trunk. She broke it with a hammer and a flat-head screwdriver from the toolbox in the kitchen. It took longer than she expected. The lock was older than she had given it credit for, and it did not want to surrender. When it finally gave, it gave with a sharp metallic crack that sounded, in the silence of the attic, like a small bone breaking. Clara opened the lid. The smell came up first. Cedar and rose water and the faint ghost of something that might once have been perfume, or might once have been the powder women put in their handkerchiefs in 1944. Underneath that, paper. A great deal of paper, arranged with a care that suggested the arrangement had been thought about. She lifted the top layer out one piece at a time, a small navy insignia. Tarnished brass, the eagle worn smooth at the edges, a folded American flag, the small kind that came home when the body could not, a bundle of letters tied with a blue silk ribbon. The ribbon had been blue once, now it was the color of a pale winter sky, faded by decades of being wound around the same small bundle of envelopes. A black and white photograph in a paper sleeve. Clara took the photograph out of the sleeve. The photograph showed a young woman, maybe 18 years old, standing in front of a Kentucky farmhouse that Clara recognized immediately as the house she was sitting inside of at that very moment. The young woman was wearing a cotton dress. She was looking at the camera with that expression Clara knew from the framed photograph above the radiator, the not smiling, not sad expression. But the woman in this photograph was not alone. Next to her, his arm around her waist, was a man in a navy uniform, tall and dark-haired, maybe 19 or 20 years old. He was not looking at the camera at all. He was looking at the woman beside him with the kind of look that Clara had seen in perhaps 4 photographs in the entire course of her life, and had never once had directed at her, including by Owen on the day of their wedding. Clara turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting she did not recognize but somehow already felt something toward, was written, "Margaret and Samuel, September 1944, forever." Clara sat on the floor of her grandmother's attic and read those 4 words 6 times. She did not know anyone in her family named Samuel. She had never heard her grandmother mention anyone named Samuel. Her grandfather's name had been Harold Dune, a quiet farmer who had died of pneumonia in 1971 when Clara's mother was 3 years old. And as far as Clara had ever known, Harold Dune had been the only man in Margaret Dune's life. Verver was a strong word to put on the back of a photograph. Clara reached for the bundle of letters tied with the blue silk ribbon. She untied the ribbon carefully. The bow had been tied a long time ago by someone who had meant for it to last, and it came loose slowly, reluctantly, the way things come loose when they have been in one position for 7 decades. The letters fell open into her lap. There were 19 of them. She counted twice. The envelopes were all addressed to Miss Margaret Marie Dune, Rural Route 2, Henderson County, Kentucky. The return address on every envelope was the string of letters and numbers she recognized vaguely as the format the United States Navy had used for mail sent home from ships at sea during the war. She picked up the letter on top of the stack. She did not open it yet. She held it in both hands and looked at the date on the postmark, September 8, 1944, 1 week before whatever had happened in the eastern corner of the property her grandmother had not farmed for 70 years. 1 week before the storm, that the old men in the general store in town still mentioned the way old men mention things they had been told not to mention. 1 week before the night Frank Calloway had deflected questions about at the fence post that morning. Clara slid the letter out of the envelope. The paper was thin as onion skin, the kind used for writing home from the war, because every ounce mattered when you were sending mail across an ocean. The handwriting was small and crowded and confident, the handwriting of a young man who had something to say and had learned to say it efficiently. "My dearest Margaret, the orders came down this afternoon. I cannot tell you where we are going. I am not certain I am supposed to know where we are going myself, only that we are going. But I can tell you this, and I can tell you nothing else, and I ask you to hold this carefully. The ship is turning. We are turning inland, my darling, which I would have told you a month ago was a thing that could not happen, and which is happening now anyway. I do not understand it. The men do not understand it. The captain does not look like a man who understands it either. But the captain is doing it. The chart in the wardroom shows a course that ends not at any port I have ever heard of, but at a railhead in a state I will not name in this letter for reasons I believe you will understand. If the course holds, Margaret, I will be close enough to your father's farm to walk there in less than a day. I do not know yet whether I will be allowed to, but I will try. Wait for me. Yours always and forever, Samuel. Clara read the letter once, then again. Then she set it down on the attic floor and pressed her palms flat against her eyes and sat very still for a full minute, because something was happening behind her eyes that she did not yet have a name for, and she wanted to have a name for it before she let it move through her. A ship turning inland, a railhead in a state he would not name, less than a day's walk to her grandmother's father's farm. Clara lowered her hands. She looked at the 18 remaining letters still loosely tied. She looked at the photograph of the young woman in the cotton dress and the young man in the navy uniform standing in front of the very farmhouse she was sitting in now. She looked through the small attic window at the eastern corner of her property where, half buried in the dirt at the rim of a hole she had dug with her grandmother's spade, the black curve of a ship's anchor was visible in the last light of the day. She said out loud, to no one, in a voice that was no longer quiet at all, "Samuel, what did you bring here?" The answer was not going to come from the attic. She already understood that. The answer was going to come from the chain, and the chain went east. She folded the letter back into its envelope, set it on top of the bundle, tied the blue silk ribbon back around the stack with hands that were steadier now than they had been when she untied it. She closed the lid of the trunk. She stood up in the attic of her grandmother's house. She said one more thing out loud before she went downstairs. She said, "I'm going to follow it." Somewhere in the dark, carried on the warm Kentucky wind through the open kitchen window below. She could almost swear she heard, though she would never be entirely certain she had heard it and not imagined it. The iron links pulled briefly taut against the earth, a chain settling, or a chain waking up. Clara went down the stairs. She sat at the kitchen table with the lights off and watched the eastern corner of her property through the window until the sky began to gray at the edges. In the hour before sunrise, when the world holds its breath before something old and buried decides it is finished being buried, Clara poured a cup of cold coffee from the pot on the counter and made herself a promise in the empty kitchen of the woman she had barely known, Grandma. "I'm going to find him." The kitchen did not answer, but the wind came through the open window from the eastern corner of the property, and it carried with it the faintest smell of rust. Clara Holt picked up her grandmother's spade from where it leaned against the porch railing and walked out into the first light of morning toward the place where the chain went into the ground. She did not know yet what the chain would lead her to. She did not know that the man in the Navy photograph was her grandfather. Not the grandfather she had been told about, the other one. She only knew what she knew that morning, that the cold thing under her fingers had not been a stone, that her grandmother had left her something, that her mother was afraid, and that a young man named Samuel had written 19 letters to a young woman named Margaret in the autumn of 1944, and had ended every one of them with the same word, forever. Clara Holt walked into the eastern corner of her grandmother's farm in the first light of a Kentucky morning and started to dig. She dug for 9 days, alone. No help sought, none offered. No machine, but the old Ford 8N and her grandmother's spade, and a pickaxe she found rusting under a tarp in the barn that she sharpened on a whetstone every other morning, because the soil in the eastern corner of the property was the kind of soil that ate edges. 5 meters the first day, 8 the second, 6 the third, because she hit a root system from a black walnut that had been dead for 40 years and still had strong opinions about where a pickaxe could and couldn't go. The chain kept going. It did not behave the way chains were supposed to behave. It curved, it looped back on itself in places. It dove down hard and then leveled out and then dove again. Like something very heavy had been dragged across the field by men who were fighting the weight the whole way, and the chain remembered every place they had lost the fight and had to regroup. Clara remembered them too, or imagined she did, which by the 7th day was beginning to amount to the same thing. By the 4th day, her hands had blistered through her gloves, and then through the blisters and into a kind of earned leather of their own making. By the 5th day she had stopped looking at the clock entirely. By the 6th she had stopped answering her phone. By the 7th Sandra Pruitt had called 11 times in a single afternoon from Boston, and finally left a voicemail that said, in a voice gone flat with worry, "Clara, honey, I am going to drive down there myself if you don't pick up by Friday. I am not joking. I have a full tank and nothing to lose. Clara did not pick up by Friday. She did, on the 8th day, hear something that made her stop digging, metal on metal. Far off, from the direction of the woods, not the chain at her feet, something further in. Something that rang once, low and dull, like a bell that had forgotten how to be a bell, and then stopped as if it had thought better of it. She stood in the trench with the spade in her hand and her shirt plastered to her back and listened. Crow. Wind. Her own breath. She put the spade back in the dirt. She did not stop. At night she read the letters, one a night, like rationing something she knew was finite. Because there were only 19, and once she read the last one, there would not be any more of them ever in her life. The third letter described a sunset over an ocean Samuel would not name. The fifth described if he had picked with a chief petty officer over the quality of the coffee and lost comprehensively. The seventh described, in passing, that his father had been a railroad foreman in Indiana, that Samuel himself had grown up listening to the sound of freight cars coupling in the yard behind their house at night, and that he had joined the Navy in part because he had been afraid that if he stayed in Indiana, he would die in the same town he was born in, and his life would amount to a series of departures he had only ever watched from a porch. Clara read that letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the small yellow light over the sink. She thought about her own apartment in Allston, about Owen, about the morning her supervisor had walked into her office on Boylston Street with his hands folded in front of him in the particular way that meant he had rehearsed what he was going to say. She put the letter back in its envelope. The 9th letter was different. The handwriting was smaller, the lines closer together. The paper was the same onion skin navy issue, but it had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn through in 3 places, and the whole thing came apart at the seams when she opened it. The 9th letter was dated September 14, 1944. The night before the storm. My darling, I am writing this from a place I am not supposed to be writing from, on paper I am not supposed to have, with the lamp turned low because we are running dark tonight and the chief is in a mood. There are things on this ship that should not be on this ship, Margaret. I am not going to write them down, I am not going to say them out loud. But I have seen them. I have seen the manifest. I have seen the men we have on board who are not sailors. I have seen what those men do at night when they think no one is watching. If I get to the farm, I will tell you everything. If I do not get to the farm, I want you to know that I tried. I want you to know that I ask questions I should not have asked and read papers I should not have read, and that I am writing this letter on the chance that the writing of it might be the only honest thing I get to do this year. Burn this when you finish reading it. Forever. Samuel. Clara did not burn the letter. Her grandmother had not burned it either, which meant Margaret June had made a decision, sometime in 1944 or shortly thereafter, to disobey the only direct instruction the man she loved had ever given her. Clara thought about that for a long time, sitting at the kitchen table with the unburned letter in her hands. Things on the ship. Men who were not sailors. What those men do at night. She did not call her mother. She wanted to. She did not. On the morning of the 10th day, she drove into town. Henderson was a small town. The kind of town where the gas station was also the bait shop, and the diner was also where you went to vote in years that ended in an even number. Clara had been in 3 times since arriving in April, and in those 3 times she had been registered by the women behind the counter at the post office and the men in the booth at the diner and the cashier at the IGA as the new Allen girl, which was what they had decided to call her, using her grandmother's maiden name, even though her name was Holt. She drove in for groceries, coffee, aspirin, bandages for her hands, which had graduated from blisters to something more permanent, and were going to need tending if she wanted to keep using them. She came out of the IGA with 2 paper bags and walked into the parking lot and almost walked directly into a woman she had never seen before. The woman was maybe 75. White hair pinned up in a way that suggested she had been pinning it up the same way for 40 years and had never had any reason to reconsider. A pale blue dress that had been ironed, a purse over one arm. She put a hand on Clara's elbow before Clara could step around her. "Honey, I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't, honey. You're Margaret's girl, aren't you?" Clara stopped. "I'm her granddaughter." The woman nodded once, firmly, as if this was what she had expected to hear. "I'm Dorothy Vane. Your grandmother and I went to school together from the 1st grade to the 12th. We shared a desk for 2 years. When the school was so crowded they had to push the desks together. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Vane, you hush. Sit down a minute, Dorothy pointed at the green metal bench outside the IGA. Clara sat. The paper bags went between her feet. Dorothy sat down beside her with the careful precision of a woman who had earned every joint she still had and was not going to waste any of them on careless movement. I heard you've been digging out at the farm. Word travels. This is Henderson, honey. Word doesn't travel. Word lives here. It never left. Clara almost smiled. Dorothy did not. You listen to me now. Your grandmother was the best woman I ever knew. The best, you hear me. Whatever she kept, whatever she didn't tell, whatever your mama wouldn't come back to see her for in 35 years. All of it, every single piece of it. Your grandmother kept it because she loved somebody. Not because she was weak, not because she was bad, because she was a woman who loved somebody truly one time, and who paid for it every day after. Clara felt her throat tighten. I didn't say she was bad. I know you didn't. I'm saying it because I lived in this town for 78 years, and I know what people are going to say to you over the next 6 months. And I want you to hear from me first, that that woman loved somebody. And she paid for it. She paid for it her whole life. And whatever you find in that field, you remember that. Dorothy patted Clara's elbow once. Then she looked at her for a long moment with something else in her eyes. Something deliberate. There's something else, Dorothy said. I have something that belongs to you. Margaret gave it to me in 2001 to keep for safekeeping. She told me, when my granddaughter comes back to the farm, you give it to her. She didn't say which granddaughter. She said I'd know when I saw her. Dorothy squeezed Clara's arm. I know now. I'll bring it out to the farm when the time is right. Not yet, but soon. Clara nodded. Not sure what she was agreeing to, but certain she was agreeing to the right thing. Dorothy stood up, walked to a maroon sedan, 3 spaces down, got in and drove away without looking back. Clara sat on the bench outside the IGA with her groceries between her feet for another 10 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. She drove home in the long blue dusk with the truck radio off and the windows down. Somewhere between the IGA and her own driveway, she said out loud to nobody at all the words that would carry her through the rest of the summer. Whatever I find, I'm going to remember. The Kentucky evening took the sentence the way Kentucky takes everything, quickly and with patience, and the chain in the eastern field waited. She dug for 9 more days after Dorothy Vane put her hand on Clara's elbow outside the IGA and told her she was holding something that belonged to her. The chain kept going. The chain kept curving. The chain kept refusing to end in any way that made sense on a farm in Henderson County, Kentucky. In the year that Clara Holt had come south with 3 suitcases and no plan, and a photograph of a woman she had barely known leaned against the passenger seat, because she hadn't wanted it riding in the back where it might shift. By the morning of the 19th day, she had cleared a trench that ran 110 feet east from the buried anchor. She had reached the high grass at the edge of the woods. The chain went into the tree line and did not come back out. She stood at the edge of the woods with her grandmother's spade in her hand and looked into the canopy. She could not see where the chain went from here. The undergrowth was too thick, the light too green and diffuse, the links disappearing under a tangle of honeysuckle and Virginia creeper, and what appeared to be the rotted trunk of a sycamore that had gone over in some forgotten storm and had been absorbed by the undergrowth so slowly that the undergrowth had grown around it and through it and made it part of itself. She did not go in that morning. She wanted to, she did not. Because something in her, some small, careful animal at the base of her spine that had been developing opinions since the day the plow caught, told her that whatever was at the other end of that chain was not a thing she wanted to find alone. Not on day 19. Not after 9 letters read and 10 still waiting, and a photograph that she had moved from the attic to the kitchen windowsill because she couldn't stand it being in the dark anymore. She went back to the farmhouse, washed her hands, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the mug between her palms, and did the thing she had been not doing for 3 weeks. She opened the laptop. She typed into the search bar the only words she had that might connect to anything recorded anywhere. Yes, Carlton. 1944. Henderson, Kentucky. The screen returned nothing useful. Links to a town in Ohio, a hardware distributor. An obituary for an unrelated Carlton from 1987. She tried again. Liberty ship Carlton, inland, derailment. Nothing. She tried. Carlton, Navy Sept 15, 1944. A single article appeared, third result down, from a regional historical society website in southern Indiana. The article was 4 paragraphs long and had been written in 1988 by a woman named Virginia Marsh, whose autobiography noted that she had since died and whose research notes had been donated to the Indiana State Library. The article mentioned the loss of a Liberty ship called Carleton in the North Atlantic on September 16, 1944. All hands lost, no survivors. The wreck had never been recovered. Virginia Marsh had included a brief paragraph noting that she had been unable to locate any next-of-kin notification records for the crew, which she described as unusual but not unprecedented given wartime record-keeping. Clara read the article twice. A ship lost in the North Atlantic, on the morning after the night Samuel's train had. She stopped herself. She didn't know yet what had happened to Samuel's train. She only knew the timeline. She only knew September 15, 1944, was the date on the last letter, and September 16 was the date the Navy said the Carleton sank in the Atlantic, and that was a coincidence she didn't have the language for yet. She closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall above the sink for a long time. Then she stood up. She drove into town. The Henderson County Public Library was a single-story brick building on 4th Street that had been a feed store until 1962, and had not entirely committed to the identity of library in the decades since. The ceiling was still too high. The shelves were too widely spaced. The smell was of old wood and paper, with an undertone of something agricultural that the carpet installed in 1978 had never fully covered. The woman at the front desk was named Helen and had been there for 28 years. She looked up when Clara came through the door and recognized her before Clara had finished saying hello. "You want the 1944 papers? I want the 1944 papers." Helen did not ask why. She walked Clara back into the small room at the rear of the building, where the older-bound volumes of the Henderson Gleaner were kept on metal shelves that smelled of rust and importance. She pulled down the July through December 1944 volume and set it on the long table under the fluorescent light. She put her hand on top of the bound volume for a moment before she let it go. The hand stayed a beat longer than it needed to. "If you find what you're looking for," Helen said, in a voice low enough that Clara almost didn't catch it, "you remember that a lot of people in this county lost somebody in that storm. Or lost somebody to what came after it." "I will." Helen left. Clara opened the September volume, September 1, 1944, Hog Prices. A revival meeting 2 counties over. A boy missing in the creek south of town, later found safe with his grandmother, September 8. A local boy promoted to corporal somewhere in France. September 15. Storm warnings posted out of Memphis. A map of the projected track, September 16. Train derailment reported near Henderson Junction. The article was 4 paragraphs. A freight train traveling north had run off the rails approximately 3 miles east of Henderson Junction during the worst of the previous night's storm. No casualties had been reported among the rail crew. Naval personnel had been on scene by sunrise. Naval personnel had declined to comment on the nature of the cargo. The article ended with the sentence, "The line will be reopened as soon as recovery operations are complete." Clara read it 3 times. She turned the page. September 17. Nothing about the train. September 18. Nothing. September 19. A small notice on page 4. Recovery operations near Henderson Junction continued. Naval personnel had again declined to comment. The line had not yet reopened. There was no additional information available to the Gleaner at time of publication. Clara flipped forward. September 23. The line had reopened. No mention of the train. No mention of the cargo. No mention of the 8 days of recovery operations. As if a freight train had derailed in the worst storm in 50 years, and the United States Navy had spent the better part of 2 weeks on the scene, and the Henderson Gleaner had collectively decided, sometime around September 22nd, that the entire incident had resolved itself and need not be spoken of further. She kept turning pages. October. Nothing. November. Nothing. December 24, 1944. A small notice at the bottom of page 6, below a department store advertisement. Harold Dune, age 23, of Henderson County, had married Miss Margaret Marie Dune at the First Methodist Church on December 22nd. The brief notice noted that the bride was the daughter of John W. Dune of Henderson County and that the groom was returning to active duty in the Pacific in January. Clara read the notice twice. 3 months. 3 months between the derailment and the wedding. 3 months between the night of September 15th and a marriage certificate. 3 months between Samuel's last letter and her grandmother's signature on a document that would govern the rest of her life. Harold Dune, who had been on leave from the Pacific, who had been brought in clearly with some speed, who had very obviously been asked to do something that required a particular kind of decency, and had agreed. Clara closed the volume. Helen was at the desk when Clara came out. Helen did not say anything. She watched Clara go with the expression of a woman who had been watching people come out of that back room for 28 years and had learned to read what they found in their faces before they had finished processing it themselves. Clara drove home in the long blue dusk. She did the math one more time in the truck, window down, radio off. A wedding in December, a baby the following June or possibly May, a baby that would be raised by Harold Dune, who was a kind man. She already felt this about him, from nothing more than the way the town spoke around his absence. Kind enough to marry a girl in a hurry, kind enough not to ask, kind enough to die quietly of pneumonia 26 years later, without the truth ever being spoken aloud in the house where it had lived the whole time. A baby, who had grown up to be Clara's mother, which meant the man Clara had always been told was her grandfather was not, which meant there was another grandfather, which meant his name was Samuel, which meant he was in the eastern field, or somewhere connected to it by a chain, and that was why the chain was there, and that was why the eastern corner of the property had not been farmed for 70 years, and that was why her grandmother had left the farm to Clara and not to Louise, and that was why Louise had said sell it without drawing a breath. Clara pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a long time. Edward Harris, Frank Calloway, was on her porch at 6 the next morning. He was sitting on the top step with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them in the posture of a man who has been sitting with something for a long time and has finally decided what to do about it. He was looking at the eastern corner of the property the way a man looks at something he has spent a very long time deliberately not looking at directly, and has finally given himself permission. Clara got out of the truck. She walked over and sat down on the step beside him without asking, "You read the papers?" "I read the papers." Frank was quiet for a moment. A crow moved across the field. The Ford 8N ticked softly in the barn, which it did sometimes in the morning, for reasons Clara had never been able to determine. "There's somebody you ought to talk to before you go any further into that tree line." "Who? Cecil Marsh?" "I don't know that name. Most people in Henderson don't anymore." "He's 96. Lives over by the old grain elevator on the county road. He worked the rail yard at Henderson Junction in 44. Frank paused. His hands tightened slightly between his knees. He was 14 years old that night. He was on the platform when the train came in. Clara waited. Frank looked at her then, directly, for the first time since she had sat down beside him. His pale blue eyes were steady and sorry in equal measure. "He's the only man left alive who saw what came off that train," Clara said. "I'll go today," Frank nodded. He started to stand, and then he didn't stand. He stayed where he was on the step, as if he had more to say and was deciding how to say it. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, as if he were saying something he had practiced saying to himself and was now saying aloud. "For the first time, your grandmother came to me in 1978. I was 32 years old. I had been farming the place next door my whole life, and I had known Margaret Dune since I was a boy. She came to the fence one afternoon in September toward harvest, and she said, 'Frank, I need to ask something of you. Something that's going to sound strange and that I can't explain.'" He stopped. "I need you not to let anyone go into that eastern corner. Not the logging company that wants the timber. Not the county surveyor if he comes back. Not anyone. Not until someone from my family comes home to this farm." Clara felt something shift in her chest. "She didn't tell you why. She told me enough. She told me there was something in those woods that needed to stay where it was until the right person came to find it. She told me she had written it down in a notebook and that she was giving the notebook to me to keep. She said, 'You're the one I trust with this, Frank, because I taught you to read and because you have never once told me a lie.'" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and brought out a small notebook, the cover dark brown leather, the edges worn to a softness that spoke of long keeping. "She gave me this. I have had it for 45 years. Clara looked at the notebook. She did not reach for it yet. "What's in it?" "A sketch of the field and the woods, the location of the anchor, and where the chain runs, and an X in the woods where she thought the end of it was. And a line at the bottom. Frank turned the notebook over in his hands once slowly before he held it out to her. She wrote, "When my daughter or my granddaughter comes home, give this to her." Clara took the notebook. She opened it. The sketch was in pencil, careful and accurate, drawn by someone who knew the land by heart. The anchor, the chain's path, the tree line, the X in the ravine. And at the bottom, in handwriting Clara had come to know better than she had expected to know it in this lifetime, one line. "When my daughter or my granddaughter comes home, give this to her." And below that, on the very last page of the notebook, in the same hand, something that had not been mentioned in anything Frank had said. A sentence addressed not to the future keeper of the notebook, but to Frank himself, as if Margaret had written it at the very end and then put the notebook away, knowing he would eventually find it. "Thank you, Frank. You are the best thing this farm has ever had for a neighbor. I am sorry it cost you so much to be it." Clara looked up from the notebook. Frank Calloway's pale blue eyes were wet. "He did not look away. She taught me to read in the winter of 1961 when I was 15, he said. "The school was closed for 6 weeks because of the flooding on the creek road. My father said I was behind enough already. Your grandmother heard and she came over and she sat at our kitchen table 3 afternoons a week and she taught me with the books she'd had at school herself. She never told anyone. When I came to school in February, I could read as well as anyone in my class, and nobody knew where I had gotten it from because she had asked me not to say." He stood up. He put his hat on. "I turned down the logging company in 1994. They offered good money for the timber in that eastern stand. I told them the access road they wanted would go across my neighbor's land, and I wouldn't allow it. The man from the company said my neighbor was an old woman who didn't have any say about what I did on my own property. I told him to leave." Frank looked at the eastern corner. "I want you to know I did not do it because I was afraid. I did it because she asked me, and because she had been kind to me when I was 15 years old and had nothing, and that is not a debt that expires." He walked back to his own house. Clara sat on the porch step with the notebook in her hands for a long time after his front door closed. Then she drove out to Cecil Marsh. The house was a small white bungalow on the county road near the old grain elevator, paint peeling at the window frames. A wheelchair ramp added at some point in the last decade that still looked new in comparison to everything around it. The yard had not been mowed since spring. A small American flag hung from a bracket beside the front door and had faded to the color of a child's crayon drawing of a flag. Cecil Marsh answered the door himself. He was 96 years old and built like a question mark, the way some very old men are built who have been carrying weight in the wrong places for too many decades. His eyes were the color of old denim. He looked at Clara for a long moment before he stepped back to let her in. "Frank called me," he said. "Yesterday evening. Said you were coming, Mr. Marsh." "I, Cecil. Mr. Marsh is a man I have not been since about 1972. She sat on a couch in a living room that smelled like coffee and pine cleaner, and the particular stillness of a house where one old man has lived alone for a very long time and has made his peace with the stillness. Cecil Marsh lowered himself into the armchair across from her, with the precision of a man who has counted every joint before sitting. He did not offer her anything. He looked at her for a long minute. "Dune girl," he said, "her granddaughter, got her around the eyes, not the mouth. Mouth's different," he studied her. "You've been digging, I have, found the anchor, I found the anchor." Cecil Marsh leaned back. He laced his fingers across his stomach. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, his voice was different. Lower, more measured, the voice of a man telling a story he has been telling himself in the dark for 82 years, and has never spoken aloud to another person. "I was 14, he said. "I had been working the yard for nearly a year. My daddy got me on, said the railroad would teach a boy more than school ever would. He wasn't entirely wrong about that, though not in the way he meant. That night I was on the platform. Storm came in around 8. Worst storm of my life, and I have lived to 96. The sky turned green around 7:30. You ever seen a green sky? No, you'd remember if you had. There's nothing like it. It means the air is doing something it shouldn't be doing, and everything that lives outdoors knows it." He paused. His fingers tightened briefly against each other. Around midnight, the dispatcher came out to the platform looking like he had seen something he wished he hadn't. He told me to go inside and not come out until morning. So I went inside. Cecil smiled. a small smile that had nothing warm in it, and then I came out again. Because I was 14, and because I had never been told something was off limits without needing to know what the limit was protecting. What did you see? A train pulled in around 1 in the morning. It was not on the schedule. I knew every train that came through Henderson Junction by heart at that point. I had the schedule memorized the way some boys memorize baseball cards. This train was not on it. 10 cars, maybe 11, all black, no markings at all, sealed, and at the back, 2 flat cars with tarps tied down over whatever was on them. Tied so tight you could see the shape of the load under the canvas, but you could not tell what the shape was. And on the platform, coming off that train with it, were men who were not railroad men. What did they look like, Navy? Some in uniform, some in civilian clothes that fit like uniform trousers cut wrong, the way military men dress when they are told to dress like civilians and have never quite learned how. Men with sidearms. Officers giving orders to other officers in voices too low to carry. There must have been 30 of them on the platform inside of 10 minutes. They were not happy. They had been in that storm for hours, and they were tired, and they were not happy, and they did not want anyone looking at them. What did they unload? Cecil was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Clara thought he had decided not to answer, and was preparing herself not to push. Then he spoke. Don't know everything that came off those cars. Wasn't my business, and I didn't have a good enough vantage point for most of it. But what came off the back 2 flat cars, those I saw. Because I climbed up on the freight scale at the south end of the platform to see better, and one of the men in civilian clothes looked up and shouted at me, and I climbed back down fast, but I had seen enough before I climbed down. What did you see? A chain. Biggest chain I have ever seen in my life, before or since. They had it coiled on the flatbed in sections, and it took 6 men to lift each coil section onto a wooden sledge they'd brought with them. They had mule teams. They had a wagon rig with iron-wheeled runners. And the front end of the chain, the anchor end, the end I now know was the anchor, though I didn't know it then, was attached to something I never got a clear look at because it was still on the second flat car, and they had a tarp on it, and they kept it covered. But whatever was on that flat car, it was heavy enough that the springs on the flat car were flat against the trucks. You understand what that means. The car was compressed under the weight, compressed flat. I have seen fully loaded grain cars come through Henderson Junction. I have seen coal cars. I have never seen a flat car spring that flat. Whatever was on that car weighed more than anything I had ever seen loaded on a single flat car in my life. And I was a yard boy who had been watching cars come through for a year. He stopped. He looked at his hands, which were still folded across his stomach, still now the hands of a man who had learned decades ago that keeping them still kept the rest of him still too. They took it out of the yard on the old logging road that runs east through the bottom land. Took the whole convoy, the sledges, the mule teams, the chain, the thing under the tarp, east through the bottoms and up toward the dune place. I watched them go as far as I could see in the dark and the rain. It took them nearly till dawn by the sound of it. I could hear the mules from where I was until almost 4 in the morning. You heard them struggling. I heard them losing ground and gaining it back. The way you hear a team when the load is too much and they are fighting every yard. He paused. When I came back to the yard the next day, the freight train was gone. The tarps were gone. The flat cars were gone. The sledges were gone. There was not a single item remaining in that yard that proved that train had ever been there. But there were marks, drag marks in the road east of the yard, 12 inches deep in places. In dry packed road that the storm had not softened much, 12 inches deep. I measured them with my hand. I have a big hand. They were still there 2 weeks later when I went back to look again, because 12-inch drag marks in dry-packed clay road do not go away in 2 weeks. They go away slowly, in months as the road gets used and the edges crumble in. But I measured them on the 2nd day and on the 15th day, and I did not forget. He stopped again. I have not spoken of any of this to another living person in 82 years, he said. My father told me not to. My father said what he said and I believed him, which was maybe the only time in my life I entirely believed him about anything, he said. Cecil, what you saw tonight is the kind of thing that ruins a boy who talks about it, and ruins a man who talks about it, and we are not going to be the kind of family that gets ruined. But you remembered every detail, every night for 82 years. You want to know the thing I remembered the most? Clara waited. Cecil Marsh looked at her with his denim-colored eyes that had seen 82 years of keeping this thing and were finally looking at someone he was going to give it to. When I was on top of that freight scale, he said, before the man saw me and shouted, I had maybe 10 seconds of a clear view of the platform and the flat cars, and in those 10 seconds I heard something. From inside the second flat car, before they had the tarp fully secured. It was not loud, it would not have carried over the noise of the mules and the sledge and the men. But I was close, and the wind shifted for a moment and I heard it. He stopped. What did you hear? Clara said. Knocking, said Cecil Marsh, from inside the tarp. From inside whatever was under the tarp, someone knocking on metal 3 times and then twice and then 3 times again. The kind of pattern a person makes when they are trying to signal that they are there and they need someone to hear them. The living room was very quiet. I said to my father, Daddy, there is someone inside that thing on the flat car. There is someone knocking. And my father looked at me and he said, Cecil, you did not hear that. And he took me inside. Cecil's hands tightened once across his stomach and then went still again. I have asked myself for 82 years what would have happened if someone had listened. I do not have an answer to that question, and I expect I will die without one. But I heard it. I want you to know that I heard it. I want somebody who is going to do something about it to know that somebody heard. Clara could not speak for a moment. When she could, she said, I believe you. Cecil Marsh nodded once, with the gravity of a man receiving something he has been waiting to receive for the better part of a century. You go home, he said, and you finish what you started. You find what's at the end of that chain, and when you find it, you call me. I want to know what they brought to Henderson before I die. I am 96 years old. I would appreciate not dying with only half the story. Clara drove home in the long blue dusk with the windows down and the smell of cut hay coming in from both sides of the road. Somewhere between Cecil Marsh's driveway and her own, she pulled the truck over to the shoulder and put her forehead against the steering wheel and stayed there for a long time. Not crying, not thinking. Just staying very still inside the weight of what she had been given. She was home by full dark. The sheriff's cruiser was parked in her driveway. It was a County Crown Victoria with the lights off and the engine running and the driver's side window down. The man behind the wheel got out as she pulled in. He was 60 years old and built like a man who had played football in 1982 and had never entirely stopped carrying himself as if he might be called on to play again. His uniform was clean. His hat was on. He held it at his side as she got out of the truck, the way a man holds his hat who was raised to take it off indoors and is genuinely uncertain whether a porch counts. You're Clara Holt, I am, Sheriff Raymond Pruitt. We haven't met, we haven't. Sheriff Pruitt glanced once at the eastern corner of the property. The anchor was a dark shape in the fading light. The trench ran off toward the tree line. He looked back at her. His face did not rearrange itself. I had 3 different people in this county call my office this week to let me know what you've been doing out here. I imagine you did. You got a permit for that excavation. I'm digging on my own land, Sheriff. You're digging on land that the state of Kentucky considers historically significant the moment that anchor comes up out of the ground. Which it has come up. Which makes this a different kind of conversation than the one you might think it is. I haven't called the State Historic Preservation Office. I know you haven't. That's the problem. If you had called on day 1, we wouldn't be having this conversation on your porch at nightfall. But you didn't. And now 3 different old men in this county woke up this week and called my office to say that the June girl is out there with a pickaxe digging up something that better not get dug up. By June girl, you mean me. By June girl, I mean you. A silence. Clara felt something hot move up the back of her neck, and she let it move without acting on it. I am not going to stop digging, Sheriff. I didn't ask you to. You implied it. I made an observation about permits. There's a difference. Sheriff Pruitt put his hat on. He did it slowly. He looked at her from under the brim, with eyes she could not read at all, which she suspected was something he had worked at. Then he said, in a voice that did not change pitch the entire way through, there are things buried in this county, Miss Holt, that don't belong to you or to your grandmother or to anyone alive. You go ahead and dig if that's your intention. But you ought to ask yourself why 3 old men called my office before you got back from wherever you drove today. And you ought to think about who told them you'd left and when you'd be back. He walked back to the cruiser. He got in, shut the door, and sat in the driver's seat with the engine running for a count of about 20 seconds, looking at her across the yard in the last of the evening light, before he backed slowly out of the driveway and drove away. Clara stood on the porch until the taillights disappeared around the bend. 3 old men, 3. She went inside, locked the door, did not turn on the overhead light. She stood with her back against the refrigerator in the dark kitchen and said out loud to the empty house, "Who told them, Grandma?" The kitchen did not answer. But through the window she could see, on the western edge of the property where the road bent past Frank's place, the headlights of a vehicle that had pulled to the shoulder and was not moving. She watched them. The headlights stayed for 10 minutes. Then they went off. Then they came on again. Then the vehicle pulled slowly out and drove in the direction of town, and the road was dark again. Clara stood at the window for a long time after it was gone. Then she went up to the attic. She opened the trunk. Not for the letters this time. She looked at the inside of the trunk with fresh eyes, the eyes of a woman who had just spent 3 weeks digging, and who had learned, in those 3 weeks, to look at the surface of things for what was underneath them. She pressed her palm against the bottom of the trunk. The wood gave slightly under her hand. Not the way old wood gives, the soft, compressible give of lumber that has absorbed a century of Kentucky humidity. The give of a panel that was not fixed. Clara pried the loose panel up with the flathead screwdriver she had brought without knowing why she'd brought it. Underneath the panel she found a single sheet of paper folded into thirds. She unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map. The eastern corner of the property, rendered in pencil with the accuracy of someone who had walked every inch of this land for 70 years. The chain's path from the anchor through the field, the tree line, the ravine, and in the ravine, marked with a small X, a place Clara had not yet been next to the X, in her grandmother's handwriting, 4 words. "I'm sorry, my love." Clara folded the map and put it in her pocket. She went downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the pocket where the map was for a long time. The phone rang at 6 the next morning. She picked it up because she thought it was Sandra. She thought it was Sandra, and she was finally ready to hear a familiar voice, finally ready to say out loud to someone who knew her before Kentucky what she had found under Kentucky's surface. It was not Sandra. "Mom, sweetheart. Don't hang up." "I wasn't going to hang up. You haven't been answering for 3 weeks. I've been busy." "Mom, Clara." Her mother's voice had the tight, controlled quality of a woman who had been rehearsing what she was going to say for a long time, and was now saying it very carefully so it would come out right. "I am asking you, as your mother, as someone who loves you, whatever you're doing out there, stop, sell the farm, come back, we'll figure something out. I have some savings, I can." "Mom, please, Clara." "Mom." She took a breath. "There's an anchor in the eastern field. There's a chain that goes into the woods. There are letters in the attic from a man named Samuel." Who was he? Silence. A silence long enough that Clara took the phone from her ear and checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Her mother's voice, when it returned, did not sound like her mother's voice. It sounded like a smaller version of it. A voice from inside a room where a decision had been made 30 years ago. "I promised her, Clara." "You promised who?" "Your grandmother." "You promised her what?" I cannot do this on the phone." "Then come down here." "I can't come." "You can, Mom." "I am asking you, as your daughter, as the person who is standing in your mother's kitchen looking at a photograph of her with a man none of us were ever told about. Who was Samuel?" Another silence. Longer than the first. The silence of a woman who has spent 40 years not saying something and is realizing that the not saying has finally run out of road. Her mother said, "I'm coming down." "When?" "Today. I'm leaving within the hour." "I'll be there tonight, Mom." "I'm coming, Clara. Please don't dig any more until I get there. Please, just wait for me." The line clicked. Clara set the phone down on the kitchen counter. She stood very still in the kitchen of the woman she had barely known and looked at the framed photograph on the windowsill above the sink. The young woman in the cotton dress looked back at her with that expression Clara had been failing to read her entire life. She was beginning to read it now. It was not smiling and not sad. It was waiting. The woman in the photograph had been waiting her whole life for someone to come back to this farm with enough stubbornness and enough grief and enough nothing left to lose to go all the way to the end of what had been started. And she had left the farm to Clara because she had decided, from 640 miles away, from the evidence of Christmas cards and occasional photographs and one phone call the week of a wedding, that Clara was the one. Clara walked out of the kitchen, down the steps, across the yard and through the gate and across the long grass to the trench. She stood at the rim. She looked down at the anchor. She said to the iron, to the chain, to the 70 years of dirt that had covered both, "She's coming." The chain did not move, but somewhere east of where she stood, somewhere in the woods at the place marked with an X on a map that her grandmother had hidden under a false bottom for the right pair of hands to find, Clara could swear the morning air shifted. The way air shifts when something that has been very still for a very long time is about to move. She honored her mother's only request. She went back to the house. She made coffee. She sat on the porch with the cup in her hands and watched the sun come up over the tree line and waited. She did not dig that day, but in the late afternoon, when the light was long and the heat had gone out of the sun enough to make the woods tolerable, she walked into the trees alone. She did not bring the spade. She did not bring the pickaxe. She brought the hand-drawn map from the false bottom of the trunk and a flashlight she did not yet need, and her grandmother's red bandana, which she had found in the kitchen drawer 3 weeks ago, and had been wearing on her wrist ever since, without entirely understanding why. The way you keep something from someone who is gone, because keeping it is the closest thing you have to keeping them. She walked east through the high grass. She crossed the line where her great-grandfather had stopped farming in 1944. She stepped into the woods. The trees were oak and hickory, old trees that had been here before anyone in her family had been in Kentucky. The canopy closed over her head, and the light went from gold to green in the space of 10 steps. The temperature dropped 4 degrees immediately. The reliable, mineral cool of old forest that has been converting sunlight into shade for a very long time. She followed the map. 20 minutes through undergrowth that pulled at her ankles and honeysuckle that caught in her hair and the silence of a stand of trees that had not had regular human company in decades. Then the ground dropped away. It was a ravine, a long, narrow cut in the limestone bedrock where some old creek had spent 1,000 years making its argument against the rock, and the rock had been slowly, incrementally losing. The walls were 20 feet high where Clara stood at the rim. The bottom was packed with ferns and fallen trunks and 80 years of storm wash, and the honeysuckle that got into everything if you let it. Clara stood at the rim and looked down, at the bottom of the ravine. Half buried in the accumulated debris of a century was something that should not have been there. It was not a tree trunk, it was not a boulder. It was the corner of something rectangular, metal, rust-blackened and riveted along the seam in the same pattern she had been looking at in the field for 19 days. Half a panel, maybe a third of one, rising from the floor of the ravine at a tilted angle, like something enormous had been tipped and caught, and had stayed where it caught for 80 years. She could not read what was painted on it from where she stood. The paint was almost entirely gone, taken by the weather and the years. But there was a word, faded, most of the letters lost to the surface rust that had crept over everything. And at the bottom of the panel, in white paint over the underlying gray, a number stenciled twice in a font she had seen in war films all her life and had never expected to see in person. The number was 7. Clara did not climb down that afternoon. She stood at the rim for a long time, with the light going gold above the canopy and the mineral smell of the ravine coming up around her. She did not cry. She did not say anything. She turned around and walked back through the woods and across her grandmother's field past the trench and the anchor to the farmhouse, and she sat on the porch step in the slanting late afternoon light, and she waited for her mother. Louise Holt arrived at 9:20 that night. The headlights swept the yard. The Subaru pulled in. The engine cut. The door opened. Clara's mother got out. Clara had not seen her mother in person since Christmas. Louise Holt was 58 years old, slender gray at the temples, dressed in the practical traveling clothes of a woman who did not want to be remembered by what she was wearing on the night she did this thing she was doing. She had a small overnight bag in one hand. She had not been crying. She had the face of a woman who had finished crying somewhere around the Tennessee border and had decided that whatever was left was going to be done with dry eyes, and whatever composure could be assembled from the pieces of herself that had survived the drive. She stood at the foot of the porch steps. She looked up at Clara. "I haven't been on this porch in 35 years, she said. "I know, Mom." Louise closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, they had Margaret's green in them. The same green Clara had been looking at in the photograph above the sink, without connecting it to the woman in front of her for 30 years, and now she could not unsee it. You found the trunk, I found the trunk, the letters. You read them, most of them. Louise looked past Clara, at the farmhouse door, at the rectangle of warm light from the kitchen window, at the shadow of the photograph visible on the sill. Then she said, in a voice that had been 40 years arriving at the moment of saying it, "Samuel Briggs was your grandfather." Clara did not move. The man in your wallet. The man in the photograph you have carried since you were 12 years old. The man you called Grandpa Harold at every Christmas you can remember. He was a good man. He was a genuinely kind man who loved your grandmother the way a man can love a woman he came to through circumstances neither of them chose. But he was not the father of her child. He was not the man she had loved first. He married your grandmother in December of 1944 because she was pregnant, and because the man who was supposed to marry her was dead in a ravine in the woods on the eastern edge of this property, and because no one was ever supposed to know that. The world went very still, Clara said, in a voice that did not sound like her own voice. He died in the ravine, he died on the train. He died when the train derailed, he died in the storm of September 15th, 1944, in the eastern field of a farm that belonged to a family who had been pressured into keeping the secret of what went there for as long as they lived. The Navy spent 8 days getting what remained of the train and what remained of the cargo and what remained of the men who were on it into the woods on this property. And then they left, and my grandfather, your great-grandfather, was told to plow over where the anchor lay and to never walk east of a certain line and to take what he knew to his grave. He did all three. Louise picked up her overnight bag. She walked past Clara and through the front door of the house her own mother had lived in alone for 35 years, and she did not look back. Because she had spent 35 years looking back at this house in her mind, and she was not going to do it on the threshold, on the night she finally came through it. Clara stood on the porch for a long moment by herself. The night was warm and full of cricket sound and the smell of the fields. The anchor was a dark shape at the edge of the lit yard. The tree line was black against the dark blue sky. She followed her mother inside. The kitchen was lit by the small yellow bulb above the sink. The corners of the room were in shadow. The clock above the stove was still stopped at 4:15, as it had been since Clara arrived. The refrigerator hummed. Louise was already at the table. She had taken down the bourbon bottle from the cabinet above the refrigerator. She had poured 2 fingers into a jelly glass and was not drinking it, only turning it a quarter turn at a time on the wood, the way a person turns something when they are warming up to saying what they came to say. Clara sat across from her. She did not pour a glass. She wanted one. She did not pour one because she wanted to remember every word. "I was 18, her mother said. "I know. You know the year. You don't know what 18 meant in this house in 1986. Tell me." Louise turned the glass again. "I had just been accepted to Wellesley. My acceptance letter was on this table, right where your elbow is, and your grandmother sat where I am sitting right now, and she said she had something to tell me before I left, before I went north. Because if I went north without knowing, she said, I would carry the wrong man's name in my head my whole life, and she could not let me leave with that." Louise looked at the glass. "She told me Harold Dune was not my biological father." Clara nodded. She had done the math in the truck that evening. Harold Allen was a good man. Harold Dune, yes, he was. Louise finally looked up. "He raised me. He raised your Uncle Bill, who you never met because he died in 1981, who was also not biologically his, though that is a different story. He took us both, knowing. He married your grandmother knowing what he was taking on, and he raised 2 children who were not his without ever making either of them feel that distinction. And I think, Clara, I've thought about this for 40 years, I think your grandmother did love him. In a real way, in the way a woman loves a man who has been steadily and genuinely kind to her for 3 decades. But that is not the same as the way she loved Samuel Briggs. And the difference between those 2 loves is what made her a quiet woman who stared out a kitchen window for the decade before Harold died. What did she tell you about Samuel?" Louise took a sip of bourbon, set the glass down. "She told me what I am going to tell you. Some of it I pieced together later, after I left, in the years when I tried to understand it from a distance, because I could not bear to try to understand it up close. Tell me." Louise looked at her daughter. Samuel Briggs was the son of a railroad foreman in Indiana. He met your grandmother at a county fair in Henderson County in the summer of 1942. He was 17, she was 16. He came back twice on furlough before he shipped out. They were going to be married after the war. He had written her father a letter asking for permission. Her father wrote back saying yes. That letter was in the trunk too. You haven't gotten to it yet. Tell me about the ship. He shipped out in March of 1944 on a Liberty ship out of Norfolk. Convoy duty. Atlantic crossings. He was not supposed to be anywhere near Kentucky for the duration of the war. Louise paused. In September of 1944, his ship was reassigned to a thing that did not officially exist. A thing that had no name that anyone who knew about it would write down. Samuel, in the 9th letter, which I know you have read, broke procedure, because he had seen something. And because he knew that whatever was happening on that ship was something he did not want to die with and have no one else know. The men who were not sailors. The men who were not sailors. The crates marked with red paint. The men who came aboard in handcuffs. Louise's voice had gone low and steady, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this enough times in her own head that the recitation was what she had left. The official cargo was scrap metal. Salvage steel from 2 cruisers too damaged to repair, being hauled inland by rail to a smelter in Indiana. That was what the manifest said. That was what the Navy would say if asked. The real cargo was something else entirely. What was the real cargo, Mom? Louise folded her hands on the table. The hold of that ship had been cut out of the ship, she said, welded to a rail car, transported inland sealed, with its original chain and anchor still attached to the forward section, because there hadn't been time or reason to remove them. Inside the hold were 47 American servicemen, Army, Marines, Navy, who had been quietly removed from various holding facilities between June and September of 1944 under the cover of administrative reclassification. They had been used as test subjects. The documents your grandmother eventually received used the phrase Battlefield Survival Studies, Class 3, conducted by a research detail that did not wear uniforms. That brought aboard equipment in crates marked red. That referred to the men inside the hold as subjects. Clara heard the word land on the table between them. 47, Samuel counted them, Louise said. The night before the train pulled into Henderson Junction, he counted them in the hold. He wrote down the number in his last letter. 47, silence. The train derailed, Clara said. The train derailed in the worst storm in 50 years, 3 miles east of Henderson Junction. The Navy arrived before sunrise. They spent 8 days at the wreck site. They could not salvage what was in the hold. The hold had gone down into the ravine in the eastern woods of this property, which was the closest piece of private land large enough to accept it, and the owner of the property, your great-grandfather, had been pressured into compliance. Told what would happen to his daughter if he didn't cooperate. Told what would happen to his daughter if he ever spoke of it. He signed a paper. He went home. He kept the land east of a certain line fallow for the rest of his life. And your grandmother kept it fallow after him. Not because she didn't know, but because she had been told, before she was old enough to make a different choice, that speaking would cost her more than she could afford to lose. Clara pressed her palms flat on the table. The men in the hold were dead, Louise said quietly. They had to have been. Samuel was dead. The crew on the flat cars was dead. Everyone who had been near that section of the train in the storm was dead, and the Navy did the arithmetic that a country at war sometimes does. The arithmetic that says you cannot undo this, and the simplest path forward is to make it disappear into the ground of a private farm on a county road in Henderson, Kentucky, where it will stay until the last person who knows about it dies and takes it with them. Only nobody died. Nobody died. Harold died, my grandfather died, but Frank Calloway's mother kept her husband's silence. Cecil Marsh's father kept his. Dorothy Vane kept Margaret's confidence, and Margaret kept the rest of it herself in a trunk in an attic with a broken lock, until she decided she was tired of keeping it, and she wanted someone else to finish it. Louise looked at her daughter. She wanted you, Louise said. She watched you grow up from 640 miles away. Through Christmas cards and the photographs I sent once or twice a year, even in the years I was too stubborn to bring myself down here. She watched you graduate and watched you marry Owen. And she told me on the phone the week of your wedding that he was not going to last because he had eyes that moved away from you when you weren't watching, and that you would come back to yourself after he was gone. Louise stopped. She said one more thing. What did she say? She said, "That girl has my stubbornness. She doesn't have Harold's patience, and she doesn't have yours either. Brenda, Louise, she doesn't have mine. What she has is mine, and if she ever ends up on this farm, she will dig until she reaches the bottom of it. And I am going to leave her everything I have because I want her to be the one. Because she has the bones for it, and I do not, and neither do you, and I am tired of carrying it." Clara's eyes filled. She did not let them spill yet. She wanted me, she said. She wanted you. The two of them sat in the kitchen in the soft yellow light, and they did not say anything for a long time. The clock was still stopped at 4:15. A wind came up outside and moved through the screens. Louise reached across the table and put her hand on top of Clara's hand. Clara did not pull away. She had not let her mother put her hand on hers since she was 16 years old. She did not pull away, and then Louise said, "I came here once, before tonight. I came alone, in 1997, when you were 11. I didn't tell you." She looked down at their joined hands. "Your grandmother brought me out to the ravine. She stood at the rim with me and she pointed down. And I looked at what was down there, and I turned around, and I walked back to my car, and I drove home, and I never came back." Clara looked at her. "You saw it. I saw the corner of it. And I couldn't." Louise's voice was the smallest Clara had ever heard it. "That is the thing I have never been able to forgive myself for, Clara. Not the secret, not the promise. The fact that I came here and I saw it and I turned around. That is what I did. And every year after that, when I found a reason not to come back here. Part of the reason was that I couldn't look your grandmother in the face knowing that I had stood at that ravine and walked away from it." She squeezed Clara's hand. "I am so sorry. That it ended up being you. That you had to do this alone, Mom. I'm sorry, Mom." Louise looked up. "You waited because she waited, and she waited because she was afraid. And we are done being afraid now, both of us." Tonight, Louise nodded. She did not let go of Clara's hand. Outside, the wind moved through the eastern corner of the property. The chain was there somewhere under the earth, still running east, still leading to the same place it had been leading for 80 years, waiting for morning. In the morning, they walked out to the trench together. Neither of them spoke crossing the yard. The dew was still on the grass, and the sun was low and long across the field, catching the black curve of the anchor and making it look almost bronze in the early light. Louise stopped at the rim of the pit and looked down for a long time without saying anything. Clara stood beside her. Louise let out a breath she had been holding. Clara realized, since some afternoon in 1986 when her own mother had sat across from her at a kitchen table and told her half of what Clara now knew in full. "He's in the ravine," Louise said. "He's in the ravine. I want to see it. You don't have to." "I know I don't. I want to. I came here once and turned away. I'm not turning away again." So they went across the field and across the line her great-grandfather had stopped farming in the autumn of 1944. Through the high grass, into the woods. Louise walked the deer path with the careful confidence of a woman who had walked it once before 27 years ago, and whose feet remembered even if the rest of her had tried to forget. They came to the rim of the ravine. Louise stood at the edge for a long moment. She looked down at the corner of the panel rising from the fern-covered floor, the number 7 still legible in white against the rust-blackened gray. "I came here in October of 1997, she said quietly. "It was raining. Your grandmother stood right here and pointed down and said, 'That is where he is, Louise. That is where they put him.' And I looked at it and something in me just closed like a door shutting." She was quiet for a moment. "I drove home and I called her from the road and I said I was sorry. She said she understood. She was very gracious about it. She was always gracious about the things that cost her the most." Clara reached over and took her mother's hand. They went down into the ravine together. The bottom was 10 degrees cooler than the rim. The air carried the mineral smell of wet limestone and old earth, the smell of a place that had been sealed from the sun for decades. Ferns brushed Clara's knees. A bobwhite called once from the brush above and did not call again. They stood in front of the panel. Clara walked the perimeter. She found the seam between plates. She found on the far side what she had come down for, a service hatch, the size of a kitchen window, warped on its hinges and rust-welded half open. Just enough room to get a hand inside. Louise did not stop her. Clara got down on her knees. She reached through the hatch into the dark space beyond. Her fingers closed on something cold and cylindrical, and she drew it out into the green light of the ravine. A metal box, the size of a hardback book, rusted shut, an eagle stamped on the lid. Below the eagle, 2 words, U.S. Navy. Louise knelt beside her in the leaves. Clara worked the lid with the screwdriver. It resisted. Then it gave with a sound like a seal breaking, and the smell that came out, old metal and something faintly chemical, and beneath both of those things the dry ghost of paper, rose between them. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job faithfully for 80 years, was a bundle of papers. The edges were brown, the ink had faded in places, but the words were legible. Clara lifted them out with both hands. The top sheet was a typed manifest on naval letterhead. The date was September 15, 1944. The header read, Operation Island Drift, Restricted. Eyes only below the header, a list, 47 names. 47 names with ranks and service numbers. United States Army, United States Marines, United States Navy, American boys. The column at the far right was headed STEESP, subsect number. Each name had a number from 1 to 47 beside it at the bottom of the page, in the clipped language of bureaucratic finality. All listed personnel are confirmed deceased per Medical Research Protocol P7. Bodies and associated materials are to be disposed of per attached addendum. Clara turned the page. The addendum was 3 pages long. It described, in the prose of an officer who had been told not to make anyone feel anything, the protocol by which 47 American servicemen had been removed from various holding facilities between June and September of 1944, transported via the Liberty ship Carlton, and used as test subjects for research referred to as battlefield survival studies, Class 3. The research had been authorized at a level the document did not name, conducted by men referred to only as the research detail, who did not wear uniforms, who did not eat with the crew, who brought aboard at night equipment in crates marked red. The research had ended on the morning of September 15, 1944. All 47 subjects were listed as deceased. The bodies were to be disposed of by burial at sea. But the Carlton had been turning inland because the bodies of 47 American servicemen who had been quietly taken from holding facilities and experimented on for 90 days could not be buried at sea, where currents and nets and the Atlantic Ocean might do what oceans do, which is eventually bring things up. The bodies were being hauled inland for disposal, in the sealed hold, on a flat car, 3 states inland, to be buried on a private farm whose owner had been pressured into silence. Clara lowered the papers. She looked at her mother. Louise was crying, and steadily, without sound. A woman finding out in a ravine behind her childhood home that the half of the story she had never been told was worse than the half she had carried for 40 years. They were American boys, Louise said. They were American boys. Clara held her mother. The 2 of them sat in the green floor of the ravine with the box between them and the manifest in Clara's lap and did not move for a long time. Then Clara put the papers back in the box. She closed the lid. She stood up. We take this home, she said. We scan every page. We send copies to a historian, to the Associated Press, to the Veterans Administration, to the National Archives, to every senator's office that will take a call. We do it all tomorrow. Mom, Louise stood up. She wiped her face. Together, Louise said. Together, they climbed out of the ravine and walked back through the woods and across the field in the morning light, and neither of them spoke the whole way, and neither of them needed to. They put the box on the kitchen table. They sat on opposite sides of it. The afternoon light came through the window and laid a pale rectangle across the wood. The eagle on the lid caught the light. Clara picked up her phone. She found the number for the National Archives reference desk in College Park, Maryland. She dialed. She was transferred 3 times. On the 4th transfer, she reached a woman whose voice was older than the previous 3 and slower and steadier, and who introduced herself as Dr. Frances Olmsted, senior researcher in declassified naval records. Clara said her name, said where she was calling from, said the words Operation Inland Drift, a silence on the line, long enough that Clara checked the signal. Dr. Frances Olmsted said, in a voice that had gone very careful and very still, Miss Holt, listen to me closely. Do not let those documents out of your sight. Do not photograph them and post the images anywhere. I am getting in my car. I will be there tomorrow afternoon. The file is about 40 pages. Are there names? 47. Another silence. Dr. Olmsted said, I have been waiting for this call for 31 years. She hung up that evening. Frank Calloway came up the gravel road on foot in the dark. He carried nothing under his arm this time. He came up the porch steps and he sat down on the porch swing beside Clara and Louise without being invited, and he did not say anything for almost a full minute. He sat looking out at the eastern corner of the property, the way a man looks at something he has finally been relieved of. He said, "My daddy worked the rail yard at Henderson Junction?" Louise went still. He was not in the salvage detail. He was not strong enough for the heavy work. But he was there that morning when the convoy came back through the yard. He saw the men from the Navy loading back onto what was left of the train. He saw their faces. Frank paused. He told me, the year before he died, that the men coming back through that yard at dawn looked like men who had done something they were not going to recover from. Not frightened, not proud, just done. Like something had been used up in them that wasn't coming back. He stopped. He kept that his whole life. He never talked about what he had seen. He never explained to my mother why he sometimes wouldn't get out of bed for 3 days at harvest time when the work was piling up, and there was no reason a healthy man should be lying in a dark room. He just carried it, until he was dying, and he called me in and he said, "Frank, if anybody ever comes to that farm asking questions, you let them ask. You don't turn them away. You help them if you can." That's all he said. Frank looked at Clara. "Your grandmother came to me 5 years after he died, 1978. That was when she gave me the notebook. I think she had been watching the farm for years by then, watching to see if anyone came, and when nobody did, she decided she needed someone on the outside of the secret who could stay put when she was gone." He shook his head slowly. "She was a practical woman. Your grandmother, she was the most practical woman I ever knew." Clara said, "Thank you, Frank." He nodded once. He went home. Clara and Louise sat in the dark porch with the swing moving slightly in the warm night air, and the eastern corner of the property was quiet, and the box on the kitchen table waited with its 47 names inside. Louise said, eventually, 2 people in this county kept pieces of this their whole lives and never knew about each other. Frank's father, and Cecil Marsh, and Dorothy Vane," Clara said. "She has something too. She told me she'd bring it when the time was right. Then there are more people who knew fragments." "There are always more," Clara said. Dr. Francis Olmsted arrived the next afternoon in a silver Honda with 2 archive boxes in the back seat and a legal pad already half covered in penciled notes. She was 62 years old, white hair cut short, reading glasses on a chain. She got out of the car and stood in the driveway looking at the eastern corner of the property and the anchor on its concrete base for a long moment before Clara came down off the porch. Francis looked at her. "I expected someone older. I get that lately. How long have you been at this?" 6 weeks since the plow caught. 19 days of digging." Frances nodded, as if this confirmed something she had calculated on the drive down. She followed Clara inside. She read the manifest and the addendum and Frank's father's account and every page of what Clara had found for 45 minutes without speaking. When she finished, she set the last page down and took off her reading glasses. "Miss Holt, Clara, what you have here is the most complete documentation of an Operation Inland Drift event that has ever surfaced. There have been partial records, there have been oral histories, there has never been a manifest. There has never been a confirmed body count or a confirmed location. There is now. Frances folded her hands. "I want to be honest with you about what happens next. The story is going to break. Too many people in this county know fragments. Sheriff Pruitt knows, or suspects enough that he as good as knows. Frank Calloway knows. Cecil Marsh knows. Dorothy Vane knows something. The number of people in Henderson County who carry a piece of this is more than a dozen. It will break. I want it to break. Good. Because once it does, once it's on the wire services, once it's on the front page of the New York Times, you are going to be the face of it, the granddaughter who found the manifest. The accountant from Boston who came home and dug until she reached the bottom. The press will want you. The Navy will want to speak with you. The Department of Defense will want to speak with you. Some of that speaking will be friendly, and some of it won't. When I was 31 years old," Frances said, "I was a junior researcher at the archives. I read a single line in a single declassified document that referenced an operational unit designation called Inland Drift, retired November 1944, with a reference to a file that did not exist. I read that line aloud at a conference. I asked the room if anyone had seen the designation before. 3 weeks later, I was told my contract would not be renewed. I spent 4 years cleaning offices in Bethesda before I was hired back by a different administration. She looked at Clara steadily. I have not told that story to anyone in 20 years. I am telling it to you so you understand that this has teeth. It still has teeth. Even now, what do? You call the AP, you call the VA, you call the National Archives reference desk in writing, you call the office of both Kentucky senators. You do all of it on the same day, and you make the story so large by the end of the first week that no single part of the government can quietly dismantle it. And then you step back. You let the families speak. You let the historians speak. You only have to be the one who found it. Before Frances had finished speaking, there was a knock at the porch door. Dorothy Vane stood on the porch in her pale blue dress with a small flat box in both hands, the kind that holds a single folded item. She had driven out unannounced, as if she had known that today was the day. Clara brought her inside. Dorothy sat at the table and looked at the navy box and at Frances Olmsted and at Louise Holt, and she did not look surprised by any of it. She set her own box on the table. Margaret gave this to me in 2001, Dorothy said. She said, Dorothy, I have something that belongs to my granddaughter. She doesn't know it yet. I need you to keep it until she comes. She pushed the box toward Clara. I have been waiting 22 years. Clara opened it. Inside, on a fold of old velvet that had once been red and was now the color of dried roses, was a ring. A simple gold band with a small stone set flat. The kind of ring a 19-year-old Indiana boy could have saved for on a Navy enlistment salary in 1943. And beneath the ring a fold of paper in her grandmother's hand. This is his. He sent it with the letter to my father. It was always mine to give to you. Clara held the ring in her palm. She did not put it on. She held it. She would carry it to the dedication. She would place it at the base of the granite wall under Samuel's name. Not flowers. The ring. The story broke on a Tuesday. The AP ran it at 6 in the morning. By 7, it was on every wire service. By noon, Clara's phone had received over 400 calls, and 3 news vans were parked at the end of the driveway, blocked by Sheriff Raymond Pruitt's cruiser sitting sideways across the gravel. Pruitt came up the porch steps with his hat in his hand and his eyes wet. He stood in front of Clara. My grandfather signed the paper, he said. He told my father on his deathbed in 1968. My father told me when I made sheriff in 2004. I have been sitting on a name I was told to sit on for 22 years. He stopped. I am sorry for how I came up your driveway last month. Clara looked at him for a moment, Sheriff. There were men in a lot of houses in this county who carried something they should never have had to carry. You're not the last one, and you weren't the worst. He nodded. I'd like to help. If you'll let me. She let him. By the end of the first week, the story had run in 73 regional papers. The New York Times ran it Wednesday. The Post ran a long feature Friday. NPR did 8 minutes on morning edition. The Department of Veterans Affairs opened a formal inquiry. The Department of Defense issued a statement that neither confirmed nor denied the existence of Operation Inland Drift and said all relevant records would be reviewed for declassification. The Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs scheduled hearings for October. By the end of the second month, the first 3 families had been found. A widow in Pittsburgh, 89 years old, told in 1944 that her husband had died in the Pacific. A daughter in Sacramento, born after her father shipped out, who had never had a body to bury. A grandson in Maine whose grandfather had been listed as missing for 80 years. The first family to come to Kentucky was the Sacramento daughter. Her name was Miriam Daly. She was 81 years old, and she walked with a cane, and she stood in the eastern field with Clara and Louise on either side of her. She put her hand on the anchor and she was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Hello, Daddy." Clara did not cry until she heard that. Then she cried. For Miriam's father, Corporal William James Daly, United States Army, whose name had been on a list in a sealed box for 80 years. For her grandmother, who had lived above his bones and the bones of 46 others without ever being able to say so. For Harold Dune, who had been kind enough to marry a woman in grief and raise another man's child and die quietly without the truth ever being spoken in his house. For her mother, who had stood at a ravine rim in 1997 and turned away and had spent 27 years not forgiving herself for it. For herself, the woman she had been 6 months ago in a 6th-floor walk-up in Alston, who had not known any of these names. Miriam reached out her free hand and took Clara's. She said, in a voice as steady as anything Clara had heard. "You brought my daddy home," Clara said. "He was always here." Miriam shook her head gently. You let me come and find him. That is bringing him home. By the end of the year, 29 of the 47 families had been located. The Navy issued a public apology in March. The President issued a written statement in April. The Senate hearings were extended twice. 6 surviving members of 1944 naval administrative officers testified, all in their 90s, all visibly relieved to be doing so. None had been part of the research detail. The men who had been were certainly dead. The authorization that had enabled them had been dismantled before the war ended and its records destroyed. Operation Inland Drift had operated for 107 days. 47 American servicemen, 90 days at sea. A storm, a ravine, 80 years of silence. The quiet acre, all 40 acres, was donated by Clara Holt to the National Park Service in May and dedicated as the Operation Inland Drift Memorial Site on a Saturday afternoon in October. 14 months after the day the plow caught, a granite wall in the eastern field. 47 names carved into the stone. A 48th name at the bottom, smaller, in a different hand, Petty Officer 3rd Class Samuel Briggs. Below his name, 4 words he tried to tell at the base of the wall, in a small glass case set into the concrete. A gold ring with a flat stone, placed there by Clara Holt on the morning of the dedication before anyone else arrived. Cecil Marsh, 97 years old, sat in a folding chair in the front row. When the 48 names were read aloud in alphabetical order, he stood up for all of them. He stood without assistance, slowly, with the full weight of what standing meant after 97 years and 82 of them spent knowing what he knew. Miriam Daly gave the speech. She stood at the lectern in the eastern field and she said, in part, I am not here because I have forgiven the silence. I am here because a young woman in Kentucky decided her family was done with it. And because her grandmother, 70 years ago, decided one of her descendants would be brave enough to finish what she could not. We are bound now, all of us families, by something that was buried. And by the woman who refused to leave it buried, Clara did not give a speech. She stood at the back of the gathered crowd and she watched the families walk one by one to the wall. She let them have it. She stayed in Kentucky. She did not go back to Boston. She turned the farmhouse into a small archive. She kept the trunk in the attic. She kept her grandmother's spade leaning against the porch railing. She kept the framed photograph of the young woman in the cotton dress on the kitchen windowsill and placed beside it the photograph of Margaret and Samuel together, his arm around her waist, both of them looking at each other in a way that Clara had stopped needing anyone to look at her, because something in her had decided to look at other people that way instead. Frank Calloway helped her clear a room for visiting family members and researchers. Dorothy Vane came 3 times that first winter and taught Clara to make her grandmother's cornbread in the cast-iron skillet that had been on the farm since 1939. Sheriff Pruitt stopped by once a month without uniform and without agenda, and they sat on the porch and did not talk about the salvage detail. Frances Olmsted drove down from Maryland twice a year and stayed for long weekends, reading in the kitchen in the mornings, walking the property with her glasses on their chain. Louise Holt sold the house in Boston in February. She moved her clothes and books and the framed photographs from the Boston hallway into the back bedroom of the farmhouse in March. She did not say she was moving in. Clara did not ask. They simply lived together. The way 2 women can live together when one is the daughter and one is the mother, and both have finally agreed that the distance between them was a geography they were done with. In the second spring after the dedication, on a warm April morning with the kitchen window open, Louise came downstairs and sat at the table. Clara, yes, I went up to the attic last night, did you? I read the rest of the letters. All of them. She put her hand in the pocket of her cardigan and brought out a fold of onion skin paper. There were 2 more under the false bottom. 21 letters total, not 19. I think she hid those last 2 deliberately. For the last person who would ever open that trunk, Clara set down her coffee. The first, Louise said, was the letter Margaret's father wrote to Samuel giving permission to marry her. Nicer than I expected from a hard man. He said he was proud to give his daughter to someone who had her kind of stubbornness. And the second, Louise set the paper on the table between them. Samuel wrote it the morning of September 15th. He gave it to a sailor named Ray Coulter to mail from the railhead. Ray Coulter made it through the storm. The letter made it to this house. And your grandmother put it in the false bottom instead of burning it. She kept it for herself, For the last person, Clara picked up the paper. She unfolded it carefully. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I did not get to the farm. I knew this morning when the chief came down to the hold and would not look me in the eye that I was probably not going to get to the farm. I have one piece of paper left and 10 minutes before they call us to move the cargo to the train. I am writing this fast and I am giving it to a sailor named Ray Coulter, who has promised to mail it from the railhead if he makes it through. Ray Coulter is a good man. If this letter reaches you, it is because he was also a lucky one. I love you. I have loved you since the county fair in the summer of 1942, and I will love you whether or not I get to walk to your father's farm tonight. I am sorry I am not going to be there to make a life with you. I am asking you, my darling, to make one anyway. Make one with whatever is left of you after this. Marry a man who is kind. Have a daughter. Tell the daughter, when she is old enough, that she had a father who tried to do the right thing in the wrong place. And then, my darling, please live. Please live for both of us. I will be in that field tonight, one way or another. If they let me come, I will come. If they do not let me come, I will be wherever they put me. I am writing this so you know that wherever they put me, I will still be yours. For further... Samuel. Clara lowered the letter. She could not speak. Louise said in the gentlest voice Clara had ever heard from her. He told her to live. He told her to have a daughter. He told her to tell that daughter. And she did. She did all of it. She had me. She told me at this table when I was 18. She did exactly what he asked. And then I didn't do what she asked. Not right away, not soon enough. I waited until you found it yourself. Louise's voice did not break. It had already broken and healed into something quieter and more durable. I'm sorry, Clara. I'm sorry I waited. Clara reached across the table. She took her mother's hand. Mom, you waited because she waited. And she waited because she was afraid. And we are done being afraid now. A pause. We are done, Clara said. Louise nodded. She folded her other hand over Clara's, and she sat in the kitchen of the woman she had spent 35 years unable to come home to. And the clock above the stove was finally running again. Clara had fixed it in January. And outside the kitchen window the eastern field was green, and the granite wall caught the morning light, and the 48 names on it were warm from the sun. On a Saturday in November of the second year, with a soft snow falling and the field gone winter grey, Clara walked out to the wall with nothing in her hands. She put her palm flat against the granite, against the name at the bottom. Petty Officer 3rd Class Samuel Briggs. She said, in a voice the wind took, Grandpa, I'm Clara, I came back. The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the field. A whippoorwill called once from the woods and did not call again. A car came slowly down the gravel road and stopped at the foot of the driveway. A small sedan with Pennsylvania plates. A man got out, maybe 70, white-haired, thin-faced. He stood looking at the house and then at the porch, and he raised one hand slowly, the way a person raises their hand when they are not certain they are in the right place, but have come too far to turn back. Louise saw him from the porch. She set down her coffee. Clara came back across the field. The man came up the gravel walk, with his hat in his hand. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. Miss Holt, my name is Thomas Daly. I am Miriam's son. My grandfather is one of the men on the wall. He paused. My mother passed last month. She asked me, before she passed, to bring you something in person. She did not want to send it by mail. She made me promise. He held out a small flat box. Clara took it. She opened it. Inside was a fold of pale blue stationery, Miriam Daly's handwriting on the outside. To Clara Holt. To be read on the porch with your mother in the winter. Thomas said, I'm going to walk out to the wall if that's all right. Of course it is. He walked out across the yard and through the snow to the eastern field. Clara watched him go. He stood at the wall for a long time, the snow gathering on his shoulders, and did not move. Clara went up the steps. Louise was already holding out her hand. Clara sat beside her on the swing and opened the letter. She read it aloud. Dear Clara, I am writing this in a hotel room in Owensboro because I could not write it on the airplane. The dedication was today. I touched the granite. I said hello to my daddy for the first time in 81 years. I want you to know something I did not say at the lectern. I did not say it because I did not want you to cry in front of all those people. When my father shipped out, my mother told me he turned back at the gangway and ran to her and put his hand on her belly. I was in there, not yet born, and he said, Polly, if it is a girl, name her Miriam. Tell her I loved her before I met her. I never met him. I was 3 months old when he was taken. But when you found him, Clara, When you put his name on that wall in Kentucky, next to 46 other boys who had also been somebody's father or husband or son, you did for him what he asked my mother to do for me the day he shipped out. You loved him before you met him. I don't know how to thank you. I don't know how to thank your grandmother. I don't know how to thank the woman in the cotton dress who waited 70 years for someone to come back to the farm. But I want to tell you what my mother said to me the night before she died. The last sentence she said before the morphine took her, she said, "Miriam, the people who love us across time. Not just inside it, you loved your grandfather across time. Clara, he loved you back. I am old and I will not see you again. But I want you and your mother both to know that the women in your family did something that women have been doing quietly since the world began. They kept a love alive that nobody else was going to keep. And when the time came, they handed it down. Take good care of the wall. Take good care of your mother. Take good care of yourself. With all my love, Miriam." Clara lowered the letter. She did not speak. Louise was holding her hand. Out in the field, Thomas Daly was walking slowly back from the wall through the snow, his head down, his hat in his hands. The snow fell harder. The whippoorwill called again from the woods at the eastern edge of the property, where the ravine was preserved now and the remains of 47 American servicemen had been respectfully returned to families who had spent generations not knowing. The boys had names again. All 48 of them. And the women in Clara Holt's family had finally, after 80 years, set down what they had been carrying. It is a strange thing to find out you are descended not from the man you thought, but from a boy of 20 who tried, in the last week of his life, to do the right thing in the wrong place. It is a stranger thing to find out that the woman you had been told was cold and distant had spent every single day of her 70 years on the wrong side of telling, because somebody had to hold it until somebody else could let it go. And it is the strangest thing of all to find out that the somebody who lets it go is you. How many women in your own family, how many quiet, careful women sitting in kitchens you haven't visited in too long, looking out windows at fields you've never seen, are sitting on something they've been waiting their whole lives to put down? How many of them are waiting right now for one of us to walk in and ask? Not to judge, not to fix, only to listen. Only to lift the iron off them at last and carry it the rest of the way to where it can finally lie still. The eastern field is quiet now, the chain settled. 3 generations of women settled with it, and the boys came home.